Hi, everyone. I'm Margaret Hask. I'm director of the Cornwall Library. Welcome to our Zoom event this afternoon. Our speaker today is Mark McEachern. Mark is a native of Torrington, a graduate of Fairfield University, and he's executive director of the Torrington Historical Society and has been since 1985. And he lives in Torrington with his wife, Gail Krupa, in the section of Torrington formerly known as Daytonville, which I think I'm going to have explained to me because I looked on a map and I didn't see it. We do have a lot of people participating in this event today, so I will have to keep everybody muted. And at the end, you can ask questions using the chat feature, please. I'll monitor that and I will hold the questions for Mark until the end. So I think that I am ready to go. Mark, are you all set?
All set.
Okay, thank you, everyone.
I'm just going to reduce the video pane here. It is a pleasure to be here today. I want to thank the Cornwall Historical Society, Cornwall Library for asking me to speak about the history of Torrington. It's a real honor to be speaking with our neighbors from Cornwall and whoever else may be on the call today. So I'm going to concentrate mostly on the history of Torrington, but I thought it would be more interesting and more relevant to include some facts about Cornwall as well. So I've interspersed some of those along with a few Cornwall history tidbits into my presentation. So let me begin. First, this is our headquarters on Main Street in Torrington, the headquarters of the Torrington Historical Society. It's the Hotchkiss Filer House. Today, it's the Hotchkiss Filer House Museum. This is the interior. It's a room that the architect simply called the front hall, kind of a very plain name for a very elegant space. We have an adjacent building that we call the Torrington History Museum, which contains a permanent exhibit of Torrington's history. Some of the images that you will see today are some images that I captured from this exhibit, particularly some objects that are on display there. We also have a machine shop exhibit in our carriage house building. The machine shop pays homage to the Hendy Machine Company and the men and women who work there making the machines that built the U.S. economy in the late 19th and early 20th century. So let me begin by showing you this historic picture of the Hotchkiss Filer House, which was built in 1900 for Orsimus Roman Filer and his wife, Mary Vail Filer. This is a picture of the couple. Around the time that they were married. I can't say that this was taken on their wedding day, but they were married on December 14th, 1865, shortly after Filer was discharged from the Union Army. And Mary, his wife, believe it or not, is a Cornwall native. She was born in Cornwall in 1844, the daughter of Sarah Bliss Vail and David Vail. And 5 years later, in 1849, the Vails moved to Torrington, probably to seek new economic opportunities. And David set up a blacksmith shop here in Torrington. Mary was raised primarily here in Torrington, attended schools in Torrington. She became a teacher. She taught in Cornwall for a while, and we have a letter in our collection that says that some of the parents in Cornwall were complaining because she spent too much time fishing and less time in class. So probably she spent some time along the Housatonic River, even back in those days. She met Filer before the Civil War, and they were married shortly thereafter. This is a picture in our collection of her mother, Sarah Bliss Vail from Cornwall. Back to Orsimus Roman Filer, this is how he looked in his later years when he built when he and his wife Mary built the Hotchkiss Filer house. He only lived here about 9 years before he passed away. During the late 19th century, he was a very prominent businessman and in Torrington and politician in the state of Connecticut. In 1896, he became chairman of the state Republican Party. He was so prominent, in fact, that Governor Weeks appointed him to the commission to erect an equestrian statue to Cornwall's native son, Major General Sedgwick, John Sedgwick. And so this is Filer's commission to serve on that commission. Unfortunately, he passed away before the commission could complete its work, which was this equestrian statue erected on the Gettysburg battlefield to Major General John Sedgwick. Filer, a few years earlier in 1887, had also contributed to erect a memorial to Major General Sedgwick in Spotsylvania, near the spot where he was killed by a Confederate sniper. I have a hunch that Filer might have been involved in some capacity in the monument that was erected to Sedgwick in Cornwall Hollow, but I haven't been able to track down that information. So here's little old Torrington at the headwaters of the Naugatuck River in northwestern Connecticut, and the waters that flow through Cornwall in the Housatonic River join with the waters that flow through Torrington on the Naugatuck River in Derby before entering Long Island Sound. So we have that connection between our two towns. This is a map that shows the early towns that were incorporated in Connecticut between 1635 and 1675. You'll notice that most of them are either along the coast or along the Connecticut River, because those were the major transportation routes at that time. Northwest Connecticut is a blank, as is northeastern Connecticut on this map. This map shows the second tier of towns that were settled between 1686 and 1734. Notice most of these towns are in northeastern Connecticut. Northwestern Connecticut is still a blank space on the map, aside from Litchfield, of course, which was founded in 1719. And the reason for that is this area, Northwest Connecticut, known as the Western Lands, was placed under the protection of the Connecticut colony in 1686 when King James II ascended to the throne of England. There was fear in the colony that King James would claim all of the unassigned lands for the crown. So the Connecticut colony assigned the Western lands to the townships of Hartford and Windsor, so that they would not be claimed by the English crown. And that was the case until 1726, when the Western lands were divided among Hartford and Windsor. Hartford received title to the townships of New Hartford, Hartland, Winchester, and East Harwinton, and Windsor received title to the townships of Torrington, Barkhamsted, Colebrook, and Western Harwinton. The towns west of Torrington, that is Goshen, Cornwall, Sharon, Kent, etc., those townships were sold at public auction, and the auctions were held at various locations around the colony of Connecticut. And Cornwall lots were first sold at public auction in Fairfield starting in 1738. All of the lots in Torrington were settled by residents of Windsor, whereas Cornwall was settled by people from various other towns across the colony. This is a map that just shows you graphically the townships that were part of Windsor, Colebrook, Barkhamsted, Torrington, and the western part of Harwinton. You may know this, but Harwinton gets his name because Western Harwinton belonged to Windsor, Eastern Harwinton belonged to Hartford, and so Harwinton is a contraction of Hartford-Windsor Town. This is a detail from the proprietor's map of Torrington that shows how the lots in Torrington were laid out. They were laid out in a strict grid with highways running north-south. Those are the lines that are mostly vertical on this map. And the lots you'll see are different sizes. That's because every taxpayer in Windsor was allotted a parcel of land in Torrington, and it was in direct proportion to the amount of taxes they paid in Windsor. So if you paid a small amount of taxes in Windsor, you got a small parcel of land in Torrington. The first division of lands was on the Western Hills. So the first settlement beginning in 1734 was in the southwestern corner of Torrington. You see it on this map. Some of the historic sites are the Strong Fowler House, the Lyman House, the First Church, Sheldon's Tavern, etc. The second tier of lots to be settled in Torrington were on the eastern side on Torringford Street, where Route 202 crosses Torringford Street, and you can see some of the historic sites there as the Griswold House and Tavern and the Second Congregational Church. The early settlers in West Torrington found these curious objects in the ground or on the surface of the ground. These are soapstone bowls that were mined, quarried, and carved by the Native Americans who lived in Torrington. So they were several thousand years old already when the colonists arrived here in Torrington. This particular bowl is in the collection of the Connecticut Museum of Natural History. It's on loan to us in our permanent exhibit. This illustration is from my a booklet that was produced by G. Fox and Company, celebrating one of the anniversaries in Connecticut. I can't recall which one it was right now, but they produced illustrations for many of the towns in Connecticut. This was the illustration that paid tribute to Torrington. It shows one of the resources that was in abundance here in the Western lands, that was timber. Both Cornwall and Torrington had great timber resources. Torrington's tall pines and hemlocks were located along the Naugatuck River in what's now downtown Torrington. I believe Cornwall's tall pines and timbers were both along the Housatonic and in Cornwall Center or Cornwall Plains, and then continuing on up to what we know as Cathedral Pines. The early settlers, because they were farmers and needed grist mills to grind the grain that they grew, and sawmills to make lumber from those timber resources, started damming all of the streams. This is a dam that was on Nickel Mine Brook in West Torrington, and it produced water power for a sawmill. Here's a typical grist mill of the period, and here's a sawmill that this image is from a collection of glass plate negatives that we have at the museum, and it's a local sawmill the picture was taken about 1900, and obviously the sawmill's in pretty sorry state here, probably collapsed shortly after this picture was taken. But you can clearly see the head race bringing water into the mill and the water wheel protected on the side of the mill. The sawmills like that produced lumber for homes such as this. This is Torrington's oldest surviving residential property. This is the Strong Fowler Abate House on the top of Highland Avenue. It was built by Jacob Strong in 1750. And although it's a timber frame house, it used sawn lumber for the floors, the walls, and the clapboards and roof boards of the house. And these early salt box houses in Torrington are distinguished by their stone chimneys because they were built at a period before bricks were available in the area. This house was built a little bit later, 1785, also on the west side of Torrington, by a man named Morehouse. And you can see this house has a brick chimney, so it's a little bit later than the Fowler House. And this house was destined to become a very historic property in Torrington because John Brown was born here on May 9th, 1800. The house was purchased by John's father, Owen, in 1799, and John Brown was born there in 1800. It was restored as an historic site in 1900. It was given to the John Brown Association by Carl and Ellen Steckel of Norfolk, who purchased the house in order to preserve it. Interestingly enough, Carl and Ellen Steckel also were benefactors for the Sedgwick Monument in Cornwall Hollow. Here's an interesting mural of John Brown leading a group of African Americans that he freed from a plantation in Missouri, and he's leading them north to Detroit, where they crossed into Canada and they could be assured of their freedom. This mural in the Torrington Post Office was painted by Arthur Covey of Harwinton, and it's you can't tell from this how big it is, but it's a sizable mural. It's probably about 4 feet tall by about 10 feet long. And if you want to see it, go into the post office, and instead of going to the counter where they sell stamps, etc., take a left and go where the post office boxes are, and you'll see this pretty powerful mural. Behind the stamp counter is also 2 other murals by Covey, one of John Brown as a young boy in front of his house, and another that depicts John Brown on one of his many visits to Torrington as an adult. And he was speaking to a group of students in Torrington, no doubt urging them to fight the evil institution of slavery. This is a great photograph of a group of Black people at the John Brown house. We don't know who these people are. However, I think John Brown would have been very pleased about this, because John Brown was one of the few abolitionists who really believed in racial equality. And he welcomed Blacks into his home and shared his supper table with them on a regular basis. I think he'd be very pleased that this group of Blacks were perhaps living in the house that he was born in at this time, before it became a museum. And unfortunately, the house burned in 1918. There was a chimney fire, and before the fire department could get there from 3 or 4 miles away, the house was fully engaged and burned to the ground. And the site today is marked by a granite tablet. But this property is owned now by the Torrington Historical Society, and there is a walking trail on this property. All of the early settlers from the colonial times up to the years of the early 19th century were farmers. Even ministers and physicians were farmers to some extent, growing some of the crops that they needed to survive. So they grew grains, wheat, oats, corn, rye, flax for linen fibers and things like that. They raised sheep for wool, and they raised pigs and cattle, both for meat. But the dairy cows were the backbone of the economy in those days. And I call this the age of cheese and butter. In 1801, Cornwall farmers produced 9,900 pounds of butter, 53,000 pounds of cheese. In 1801, Goshen surpassed the production of Cornwall by a lot. They produced 35,000 pounds of butter and almost 10 times the amount of cheese at 588,000 pounds of cheese. I don't have any figures from Torrington at this point in time, but in 1816, Torrington merchant Erastus Hodges purchased for resale from Torrington farmers 102,000 pounds of cheese and 5,000 pounds of butter. So the dairy industry was the predominant industry in Northwest Connecticut, in all of the towns, but particularly Goshen. But that wouldn't last long, because pretty soon the American Industrial Revolution would begin in the late 18th century. It didn't take hold here in Northwest Connecticut until the early 19th century, when the streams and rivers were harnessed for the production of manufactured goods, and not just subsistence products like flour and lumber. So world events contributed to the rise of the American Industrial Revolution. First, the Napoleonic Wars disrupted world trade. You might say they disrupted the supply chains as they are being disrupted today by the aftermath of the pandemic. But because goods could not be imported in typical quantities into the growing republic, there was a gap here that American industrialists began to fill. And this gap was widened by President Thomas Jefferson's embargo of 1807, which cut off imports from all of Europe, and as well as the War of 1812 had an impact on that too. So American industrialists like Frederick Wolcott stepped in to fill the gap in products, particularly with woolen goods, because prior to this time, a lot of American woolens were imported from the textile mills in England. But now, with those imports cut off and wool in great demand, woolen cloth in great demand, that had to be produced here in the Republic. And Frederick Wolcott, the brother of Oliver Wolcott Jr., opened a woolen mill here in Torrington. The manufacturing village that grew up around that woolen mill became known as Wilcoxville. So this is a woodcut, and it shows in the center of the image the woolen mill. Looks kind of like a church, but it was actually a woolen mill. It's on the banks of the Naugatuck, the west branch of the Naugatuck River in what is now downtown Torrington. So that little industrial village that was established in 1813 became known as Wilcoxville, and that name persisted until 1881 when the post office in Wilcoxville changed its name to Torrington. But I just want to make it clear that Torrington was called Torrington right from the time of its incorporation in 1740 through the present day. Wilcoxville Village was just a village within the township of Torrington, much the way that Cornwall Hollow is a village within the town of Cornwall. So I want to digress for a moment and talk about another connection between Cornwall and Torrington, and this relates to a Torrington native, Samuel Mills Jr. was born in Torrington in the Torringford section of town, which is up on the east side. In 1785, his father was a minister here, Samuel Mills, a well-known minister, as a matter of fact. Samuel Mills was at Yale studying theology when he befriended Henry Opokaia in 1809. And those of you from Cornwall are well aware of Opokaia's association with Cornwall, but you might not be so familiar with the fact that it was Samuel Mills who brought Opokaia to northwestern Connecticut. He brought him to Torrington, where he was taken in as a member of the Mills family, and he was taught English, and he was taught how to farm and skills that were needed to survive in those days. And he was also taught the Christian religion. And it was Mills who helped establish the American Board of Commissioners of Foreign Mission, which in turn established the Foreign Mission School in Cornwall in 1817. And here's an illustration of Henry Opokaia, born in Hawaii, 1792, came to Torrington in 1810. In 1816, he was on the road raising money to help establish the Foreign Mission School, and he was one of the first students at the school in 1817. Unfortunately, he died there of disease in 1818. So back to Torrington history a bit. I want to speak about some of the other industries that were established here that led to the ascendancy of Torrington as the predominant industrial town in Northwest Connecticut. These are illustrations of Israel Coe and John Hungerford, who together with Anson Phelps established CoBrass in 1834, and this became Wilcoxville Brass in 1841. These are the products that they manufactured. This is an illustration. These actually illustrate the type of products they made. These particular brass kettles we don't think were made at the Torrington mill. They might be a little bit later manufactured, but this gives you an idea of the type of products. They rolled brass and then hammered the brass into the kettle shape, attaching an iron rim and iron handle to it. This is the brass mill along the west branch of the Naugatuck River that was established by Israel Coe, John Hungerford, and Anson Phelps. Today, this is the site of the Stop and Shop Plaza off of Water Street in Torrington. You cross this west branch when you turn from Water Street into that shopping center. John Hungerford purchased this house in 1816. It was actually built a bit earlier in 1803. It was the first frame house in downtown Torrington. It was built before the woolen mill was even established here. And John Hungerford bought it in 1816 when he came to Torrington and became a merchant here in the growing village of Wilcoxville. And he later lived here with his wife, Charlotte Hungerford. And yes, the hospital here in Torrington is named after John's wife, Charlotte Hungerford. The hospital was endowed by their son, Uri T. Hungerford. And it was that endowment was made in memory of his mother, Charlotte. In 1854, John and Charlotte were able to build this home because of the success of the brass industry. This replaced their older house, which was moved across the street and stood for many years. And this was a grand mansion in the Italianate style that was built at the apex of South Main Street and Litchfield Street in downtown Torrington. And when John Hungerford sold his interest in the brass mill to Israel Coe's son, Lyman Coe, in 1863, he also sold Lyman and Eliza Coe his house. And he and his wife moved into their old house across the street. And from that point on, this beautiful home in downtown Torrington was the home of Lyman and Eliza Coe. Their children in 1909 donated the property to the city of Torrington to become Coe Memorial Park. And this is a picture of the park in 1909 when it first opened. The street on the right is Litchfield Street. The street on the left is known as South Main Street. And the boulder that you can barely see behind the elm trees is still there today with a tablet dedicating the park to the memory of Lyman and Eliza Coe. Another prominent businessman who was responsible for Torrington becoming an industrial town was Erastus Hodges. And his story is a fascinating story because it spans the age from an agrarian society to an industrial one. He started as a cheese merchant selling an agricultural product, cheese and butter. And with the proceeds from his cheese venture, he became an industrialist. And I want to tell you a little bit about some of his ventures. His domain was West Torrington. And this is a view of West Torrington from a surrounding hill. The road that you see winding from the bottom left to the upper right of the photograph is today known as the Goshen Road or the Goshen-Sharon Turnpike, which goes through Cornwall. And the church in the bottom left is the First Congregational Church in West Torrington. And the little village there is centered on the Norfolk Road and the Goshen-Sharon Turnpike. And it utilized the water power from the west branch of the Naugatuck River for the industries that were located there. So as I said before, Hodges began his career buying cheese from local farms, and he had a vast system of peddlers who sold the cheese as far south as Georgia. And in those days, it was the banking system in the country was rudimentary at best, and it was impossible to safely bring cash from the southern states back to Torrington. So he had his peddlers purchase bales of cotton in the south, ship the cotton back to Torrington, and with the cotton, he established a thread mill. And this is a picture of the Goshen Sharon Turnpike in West Torrington, the bridge over the west branch of the Naugatuck River. And the building on the left is the thread mill that was established by Erastus Hodges. So he turned the profits from the cheese business into cotton thread, which he then turned back into cash by sending peddlers out once again to sell the cotton thread. He also used the proceeds from the cheese business and the cotton thread business to establish a wooden clock business. He hired a preeminent Torrington clockmaker named Norris North. This is one of Norris North's wooden pillar and scroll clocks that was made in Torrington. They had wooden movements. Norris North invented a horizontal movement that would not infringe on the earlier patents of Eli Terry. And not only is the faceplate that you see here wood, but also the movement itself, which you can't see, it's behind the faceplate, probably contains about a dozen wooden gears. These clocks were relatively inexpensive to make because of their extensive use of a material that was in great abundance around here, wood. They used metal, particularly brass, very sparingly because there was not a well-established brass industry yet in America. But as soon as there was, then these clockmakers went back to using brass gears because they were more durable than the wooden ones. The clock faces that were used by the Torrington clockmakers were often painted by women. This is a clock face that was painted by Eliza Coles of Torrington, and she wrote in a memoir that the designs for the clock faces came to her in her dreams, and that upon awaking, she would hasten to record them so that they could then be painted to decorate the clock faces such as this. So with the proceeds from his various enterprises, Hodges decided to get involved in the growing brass industry in Torrington. So he built this brass mill in 1835. And this is a picture that was taken about 1895 that shows the brass mill, obviously in disrepair. The Hodges brass mill was not a long-lived operation, but it shows the massive water wheel, double wide, that was used to roll brass into thin sheets so that it could be hammered to make the brass kettles that were the products of the Torrington brass mills. This next slide shows some products that were actually made at the Hodges brass mill, including a beat up brass kettle at the top, a brass bowl at the right, and a brass skimmer at the bottom. I want to take a short look at the population census of Cornwall and Torrington from this time period, from roughly the time of the American Revolution to till 1830, the early years of the new republic. So throughout this time period, Cornwall actually had a greater population in Torrington, not by a lot, but definitely had a lead in population. In 1835, when John Warner Barber traveled Connecticut making sketches for his book, Connecticut Historical Views, he sketched this view of the growing industrial village of Wilcoxville, where the woolen factory was located. And at that time, Wilcoxville had, according to John Warner Barber, a congregational church, an academy, 4 stores, 2 taverns, and a woolen factory. And at the same time, when Barber traveled to Cornwall, he sketched this view of the village of, well, it's Cornwall Village. In his book, he calls it South Cornwall to distinguish it from the center of Cornwall, which was then up on Route 4. This is the view from center Cornwall down into Cornwall Village. And at that time, the village also known as Cornwall Plain, had a congregational church, 2 stores, and 20 dwellings. So the railroad that came up the Housatonic Valley in 1841 and the Naugatuck Valley in 1849 really ended the isolation of towns here, such as Torrington and Cornwall, and connected them to the world at large, and was a boon to manufacturing both in Cornwall and Torrington. I love this broadside from our collection. This is 1849, the year the railroad opened to Torrington, and they're advertising a grand excursion to Bridgeport for a steamboat excursion on Long Island Sound, followed by fireworks. Don't you wish you could have been there for that? The railroad was a boon to a new generation of industrialists in Torrington, such as Arvid Dayton, born in 1814, who was a maker of reed organs or melodeons here in Torrington. This is a daguerreotype portrait of Arvid Dayton. And this is the oldest outside photograph that we have of Torrington. It was a daguerreotype view that was taken of Arvid Dayton's melodeon factory, which was located on North Main Street in Torrington, kind of near where the North End Firehouse is today. And it was on the east branch of the Naugatuck River. It used the water power from the east branch to run the machinery in Dayton's factory, the machinery that was used to make his melodeons. And in this photograph, you can actually see 2 workers carrying a finished melodeon out the front door of the factory, about to load it on a horse and wagon. And I find this very interesting. Up at the cornice of the building facing Main Street, attached to the left of Arvid Dayton's name, is a keyboard from one of his melodeons. A keyboard much like this one pictured here. This is one of these small portable melodeons that was made part of our collection at the museum. And here's a photograph of Arvid Dayton's son, William, who was no doubt an accomplished musician, as you would guess from this photograph. He's seated in front of one of his father's melodeons, but he was known for something else. He became chief mechanic of the Excelsior Needle Company, and William Dayton developed or perfected the swedging machine, which was used for making needles and was the machine that built the Torrington Company. Another pre-Civil War industry in Torrington that was very successful was the Albert Carriage Company. They made peddlers' wagons, which were in great use, taking products made in Torrington and other towns in the Northeast to other areas of the country where they were in great demand. Gale Borden established his condensed milk factory here in Torrington in 1857 in the north part of the village, in the north part of Torrington, in the village that was known as Burville. Oh, and by the way, let me backtrack just a little bit and just confirm for Margaret that the village of Daytonville was indeed the area that surrounded Arvid Dayton's melodeon factory on North Main Street. James Ashborne established a guitar factory in Daytonville in 1848, and that was a very big part of Torrington's economy until 1864. As a matter of fact, Ashborne he was the largest guitar maker in America at that time period. Even though the Martin Guitar Company was in business, Ashborne was the first to use the factory method to make guitars. And because of that, he could make them in far greater quantity and with no sacrifice in quality. He had, whereas guitar makers prior to this had one guitar maker make the guitar from start to finish, Ashborne developed a factory system where he had many many men working in an assembly line, essentially, making guitars, each specializing in a part of the process, perhaps making the body of the guitar, the neck, doing the decorative inlay on the face of the guitar, or making the tuning mechanisms. This is the guitar factory that James Ashborne established very close by to Arvid Dayton's Melodeon factory. And I think you might notice that both factories are similar in size and shape. So let's go back to, I can't believe it's 4:41 already. Let's go back to the population census here. And this is important because between 1850 and 1870, Torrington finally surpassed Cornwall in population. And that was sometime in the decade between 1850 and 1860. And I think, and I'm sure this is due to the rise of many industries here in Torrington, attracting workers from not only surrounding towns, but also from foreign countries, immigrants who came here through Boston and Ellis Island. Eventually, many of them eventually found their way to Torrington to seek jobs in the factories. Some of those factories included the Turner and Seymour Manufacturing Company, which made hooks and eyes. This is a sample of their packaging. The Excelsior Needle Company took over the James Ashborne Guitar Factory as it went out of business, but they didn't last long there because they outgrew it so quickly because of the demand for their machine-made needles. And this is a picture of their second factory along the railroad tracks in the center of Torrington. There was a hardware company established in Torrington in 1866, and one of their first products were beer coolers. And soon they branched out to make ice skates and roller skates, such as the roller skate pictured here. They held several patents on roller skate production. The woolen mill continued to be a mainstay of the economy during this time period. And this is a picture of the Union Manufacturing Company woolen mill when it was still located on Water Street. Later, it would move to the north end of Torrington and be renamed the Warrenton Woolen Mill. It's now been preserved and repurposed as condominiums. These workers at the Hotchkiss Brothers Company on Water Street supplied the growing community with lumber and labor to build many of the buildings here in Torrington, including the Hotchkiss Filer House Museum. Let's take a quick look at these 1874 maps of West Cornwall, showing Cornwall's industrial centers at this time period, which were Cornwall Bridge, with the Cornwall Bridge Iron Works being the predominant industry there, and West Cornwall with the Union Shear Company and the Gold Sanitary Heating Company located along the river. But Cornwall didn't have the extensive floodplain along the river like Torrington did, and I have a hunch that that might have limited Cornwall's industrial viability, because it did have the river and it did have the railroad, two things that Torrington also had. But Torrington also had a lot of land for industry to spread out on, and there was not so much in West Cornwall or Cornwall Bridge. Here's Torrington at the same time period, showing the Naugatuck River, the east and west branches coming through Torrington. And along the river, you see the brass mill at the left, then the woolen mill, Turner and Seymour Company, the Cove Furniture Company, and at the far right, the Redfield and Rice Spoon Shop, which was the successor to the Albert Carriage Company. This is a view from the bridge in the center of Torrington, looking upstream at about this time period. The building on the right is the Turner and Seymour Company, which took over the old cotton mill, which went out of business in the early years of the Civil War because, of course, they couldn't get cotton from the southern states. And then the building upstream in the background is the woolen mill. The village that grew up around these industries looked like this. This is the corner of Main Street and Water Street, or 5 Points as it's known today, with a hardware store and the granite block on the right. The buildings on the east side of Main Street were Well, most of the buildings in downtown are made of wood, as were these buildings on the east side of Main Street. This is about where Sasso's Pizza is located today, and has a decidedly Western-looking flair. I think you'll agree with that, as do these buildings, located about where the Nutmeg Ballet is located today, Scoville grocery store, and the vibrant and Deming drugstore. The next thing that happened to boost Torrington's industrial production was the advent of the American system of manufacturing, which utilized precision-made interchangeable parts to produce consumer goods, and it started out with guns and clocks. And companies like the Hendy Machine Company in Torrington were instrumental in that American Industrial Revolution, because they produced the machines that could hold the tolerances to produce precision parts. This is the Hendy Machine Company about 1870, and this is what it looked like about 1925. We'll go back. Look at that growth. It's just phenomenal in that short time period. Here's some workers at the Hendy Machine Company draped over one of the milling machines that they were making. And the brass mill continued to grow and thrive. And look at this growth between about 1890 and 1920, when it was part of the American Brass Company. By the way, the buildings on the right in this illustration are still standing along the river. They are used by the Susan B. Anthony Project as their headquarters, and a manufacturer of foam cushions for seating. The Excelsior Needle Company continued to grow. This new building located on Franklin Street is still there today. It's across the street from the newly erected Litchfield County Courthouse. This is the swedging machine that made that company. These are some of the needle workers at the company. My own grandmother worked here for 50 years. This is one of my favorite photographs in the collection. It's some of the workers at the Union Hardware Company fishing rod department. They made both bamboo and steel fishing rods. Agriculture was still very prominent, even though all this industrialization was taking place in the valley. There were still dozens of dairy farms in the hills of Torrington, even though the river valley was the industrial center. So look at what happened to the population in this time period. Cornwall continues to decline in population from 1880 to 1910. Torrington is doubling in population every decade, from 3 to 6 to 12 to 16,000 residents. And this was due both to in-migration from surrounding towns, people seeking jobs here in the factories, and also immigration to Torrington from other lands. This pie chart in our permanent history exhibit tells the story. In 1910, Torrington's native-born population was about 1/3. The immigrant population pictured at the top left was about another third, and the children of immigrants, also native-born, were the last third of the population. I just want to quickly run through some immigrant groups here in Torrington. There was a sizable Swiss population here in Torrington. These happen to be my great-grandparents, Albert and Louisa Hassick, who came from Switzerland and first settled in the Ellsworth section of Sharon, and they worshiped at St. Bridget's Church, which I always thought was in Cornwall Bridge, but now I understand it's actually over the river in Sharon. They came to Torrington in the late 19th century. Albert probably to seek employment here. He got a job in the brass mill, and with the money he saved from his paycheck, he eventually bought a dairy farm here in Torrington. But he didn't give up his job in the brass mill. He kept working at the brass mill, so essentially working day and night. Here's a group of Scots immigrants who came here to work predominantly at the Hendy Machine Company. And this is a social club that they formed known as Clan Stewart. The Irish immigrants were here from the mid 19th century. These are members of the Kelly family. This is Karsten Jansen, who was a German immigrant who was an architect and builder here in Torrington. This is a very interesting group of immigrants to Torrington. These are Syrian immigrants who came here in the late 19th, early 20th century. They're from the area around Beirut, which is now part of Lebanon. So their surnames include names some of you may be familiar with: Jacob, Halaby, Haddad, and Khoury. It's another group of Swiss immigrants who formed a gymnastics society. So these are some Slovak immigrants to Torrington. Their descendants still live in Torrington and surrounding towns. The Italians were the largest immigrant group at this time period. This is Tom Minetto and his wife, who had a produce store in Torrington. The DeMichaels were the largest, or not the largest, probably the most prominent Italian family here in Torrington, because they had a very successful stone cutting and road construction business. I call them the O&G of their day. This is the house that they built on High Street that's now occupied by the McCall Foundation. It was called Villa Friuli, no doubt a nod to the region of Italy that they came from, northwest of Venice. A lot of the Italian immigrants in Torrington came from northern Italy, from the Lake Como area, and from the Piedmont region, which is west of Milan. And some of those Italians from the Piedmont region formed the Piemontese Society, and you can see them pictured here having a dinner at their meeting hall in Torrington. I want to mention this Italian immigrant in particular, Joseph Bezzozzi. Came to Torrington in 1898. He became a contractor. He had a son named Charles, who married a Cornwall girl, Mabel Locke, and this is a snapshot of them taken about the time they were married. They met during the war, working in Bantam at the Warren MacArthur Company, and they were married shortly thereafter. And they moved to Cornwall, and they lived in Cornwall, not Cornwall Hollow, the Dudleytown Valley, near Cornwall Plain. And Mabel's father was Gustav Locke, who was a gardener for the Calhoun family. But Mabel and Charles had 3 children, Elizabeth, who some of you may know as Lolly, Carla, and Charles, who's known as Duke. Lolly and Duke still live in Cornwall. Here's a picture of Charles in his later years, and he was a prolific folk painter. He was very interested in American history and painted a lot of subjects devoted to that topic. And this picture on the right is one of his paintings. It depicts Benedict Arnold leading his soldiers through the Maine wilderness to assault the English at Quebec City in 1775. This is a French family that came to Torrington, the Zales. This is a Romanian family that came to Torrington, the Neags. And this is a picture of Torrington about that in the late 1870s. It shows the street pattern that exists today. Most of the buildings on this map have been replaced by more modern structures. I'm just going to show you a quick view of some of those buildings. The mills along the river are all gone. Turner and Seymour on the right, the woolen mill and the brass mill in the distance. Fusnich Park is still here today. This was a gift of German immigrant Frederick Fusnich to the residents of Torrington. The high school pictured here burned in 1913. This is the class of 1907 on the front steps of Center Congregational Church. Main Street in Torrington, about 1910, showing the Lily Block and the Yankee Peddler Inn. These buildings on the east side of Main Street were demolished in 1930 to build this landmark, the Warner Theater. The Yankee Peddler Inn, still there today, was built in 1891 as the Conley Inn. It badly needs a person with deep pockets to restore it and open it once again. And this is the YMCA building on Main Street, now a retail shop called Remember When. This is the high school that replaced the building that burned down in 1913. It's now repurposed as an elementary school. Torrington had, believe it or not, had a trolley that ran from Torrington to Winsted. This is the picture of the trolley car on South Main Street. And because the population growth was so great in Torrington, it became a city in 1929. And this view shows the new city hall being constructed in front of the old town hall, which was later demolished. Torrington is known for its pizza, as you well know, and this is Al's Pizza Grill on East Main Street in Torrington, one of the first pizza restaurants in the city. The bridge over the river in Torrington once held shops, Torrington's own Ponte Vecchio, and those were destroyed in the flood of '55, as you can see in these photographs. But Torrington rebuilt after the flood, but in the 1960s, Torrington was not immune to the redevelopment craze sweeping America, and this neighborhood on South Main Street next to the river was demolished to build an automobile-centric shopping center known as the Torrington Plaza. It's still there today. It's where TJ Maxx is located. As a matter of fact, TJ Maxx is located where I think where this picture of the first national store is from the 1960s, late 1960s. Immigration continued in Torrington in the 70s. The war in Southeast Asia brought influx of immigrants from Vietnam and Laos. In the 80s, some Tibetan immigrants arrived here by way of Nepal. And in the 90s began the Latino immigration from Ecuador and now the Dominican Republic. This is the Borgia family who came here in the 1990s and was the beginning of what I think is the largest immigrant group in Torrington today, the Ecuadorians. And this is a picture of taken 2 years ago showing the Diversity Club at Torrington High School with some Ecuadorian students celebrating that diversity. So Cornwall had a low in population in 1920. Torrington at that time in comparison was still growing, had a population of 22,000. But from then till now, I don't think either town both towns have experienced some population growth, nothing terribly dramatic. Although if you look at the numbers, Cornwall is about doubled in population. Torrington, not quite so. But Torrington today has a vibrant arts and culture district. And I encourage you to visit Torrington and experience our history, arts, culture, and diversity. And that's my program. I hope you enjoyed it.
Thank you, Mark. That was fascinating. I loved seeing the march of immigrant groups coming in. I love the old photos. We do have one question about the murals, the John Brown murals. Do you know when they were painted?
They were painted in the 1930s, and they were originally in the post office on Main Street, on the corner of Main and Church Streets. They were part of the original decoration in that building when it was built during that time period. And then when the post office relocated to its current location on East Elm Street, the murals they're actually painted on canvas. They were actually removed from the walls and reinstalled in the new post office location.
I have another question. Do you have photos of more early families? This person is writing, my grandparents, Mussolini, came to Torrington from Switzerland in 1893, living above a schoolhouse. My grandfather died in 1896, and my grandmother remarried, perhaps to Pierre Martin, and lived on Grandview, which is no longer there. Do you have other family photos?
We do. I can't say that we obviously don't have photos of every family, but what was the surname again?
Mussolini, Muzzulini.
It's not ringing a bell with me as part of our photographic collection, but we could check. You know, if somebody would like us to follow up on that, they should email us. Can email us through our website, and we'll answer that question more thoroughly.
Okay, and here's a question. Any comments on the bearing industry growth? I think Torrington Bearing ultimately purchased my Timken Bearing.
Right, exactly. That was the death knell for the Torrington Company. The Torrington Company had two big divisions. They had the needle division and they had the standard division. The standard division made, believe it or not, made bicycles, among other things, but they also specialized in bearings. And in the early 20th century, well, before World War II, they invented the needle roller bearing, which had applications in the aerospace industry and became one of their great successes. And they were purchased by, as our participant noted, they were purchased by Timken Bearings in, I can't remember the year, but it was the early, maybe 2010 or a little bit earlier. And of course, Timken said that they were going to keep the bearing company open here in Torrington, but within 2 years, they shut everything down and they were a presence here no longer.
That's a shame. Another question about the old Wolcott estate in Torrington. Do you have any information about that?
Well, I know Frederick and Guy Wolcott had a house on Allen Road in Torrington. I'm not sure what our listener means by the Wolcott estate.
Right.
Unless it's Wolcott Hall, what's known as Wolcott Hall. It's a convalescent home on Midgeon Avenue. Is that the property they're referring to?
I can't tell. I don't have any more information than that question.
Well, Wolcott, just as a point of interest, Wolcott Hall on Midgeon Avenue was once the Midgeon estate.
Another person asked if it's possible to trace the history of a house built in 1890. How would that be accomplished?
I mean, there are two ways we can do that. We have city directories for Torrington. I think they're also available online. Those are very useful in tracing the history of the house. We also have a pretty good collection of Sanborn insurance maps in our archives, and we use those all the time for tracing the history of properties as well. Again, if somebody wants to do that, they should contact us by email to set up an appointment.
Another question is about brass making. How is brass made and what minerals were mined in Torrington to make it?
Well, the minerals are copper and zinc, neither of which exist in any quantity in Torrington. There was a copper mine in West Torrington, and they were able to extract about a half a pound of copper out of it at a cost of about $30,000. So that was not viable using copper from Torrington. So all the materials to make brass were imported. So that was probably one of the factors why the industry did not persist here, because all the raw materials had to be transported in. I mean, they came in by railroad, which helped because it was economical to transport things by rail, but then all the finished products had to be transported out again. And eventually the brass mills were moved closer to the sites of the raw material.
There's another question referring back to the Torrington Company. This person asks if the buildings are going to be demolished. They've noticed that the windows have been removed recently.
Right. Those buildings were part of the standard plant. That was the plant that made the bearings. And the short answer to that question is yes, they are going to be demolished.
Oh, that's too bad.
Yes, it is.
Another question about the Historical Society building. When does it open? Is it open daily or what are the hours?
So our History Museum exhibit is open Wednesday through Saturday from noon to 4 p.m. It's free admission to that exhibit. And the House Museum currently is open Thursday, Friday, and Saturday from noon to 4. Those are guided tours, and those are $7 per person.
Okay. That is about the end of the questions. There's a request for a part 2 of this talk about the businesses that went through Torrington. And lots of thank you for a very, very interesting presentation. And I certainly join in that. This was fascinating. I'm grateful for it. Thank you, Mark.
It was a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Good night, everybody. Thanks for joining us.